department on the main campus here. It's great to see all of you. I'm Laura Gomez, and I am with Nancy Lopez, co-director of the Institute for the Study of Race and Social Justice, which is sponsoring this lecture. We are sort of being incubated by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Center for Health Policy. And this talk today by Dr. Darity is doing double duty as a Center for Health Policy, as part of the Center for Health Policy series and part of our Institute series. The Institute series is called Troubling Race, Cutting Edge Research Across the Disciplines. And the objective of this series, this is the third in 4 lectures, is to get us thinking critically about how we use the term race, what we mean by the term race, and more significantly perhaps, how we operationalize race, or how we measure race in our research. And in particular, Nancy and I believe that this conversation has to happen across disciplines. And we have a working group working on precisely this issue of coming up with transdisciplinary ways of conceptualizing and operationalizing work race this semester. And several members of that group are here. It's also great to see them. I want to just say a few administrative things before we get started with the introduction of Dr. Darity. And the first is to say that a tremendous thank you to Bob Valdez and to Gina and Shirley and other staff from the Center for Health Policy for organizing this event. Is sitting at the red table at the back and sign-in sheets. There's also sign-in sheets for economics students that you might not know about, so that's at the room also. Our upcoming events include the last of these lecture series with Dr. Estela Gonzalez-Bouchard, which is on March 12th, Friday, March 12th, in this room at 2 o'clock. And Dr. Bouchard will be speaking he is a professor at the University of California, San Francisco, and will be speaking on self-identified race versus genetic ancestry testing for lung function predictions among African Americans. So he's comparing these 2 different measures of race in his research on African Americans. He will probably and a lot of research on Latinos in the Bay Area as well. So a little note about format before I introduce our speaker, which is that our speaker will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we are delighted to have today, leading off our questions, Richard Santos, professor of economics, and Veronica Salinas, a Robert Wood Johnson fellow in the economics department. Where is Veronica? Right there. Great. Right there. Delighted they're going to lead off our questions, and I wanted to also thank.
So that explains why she read so much of
the center to thank Africana Studies and the economics department for helping us to bring Professor Darity to UNM. Today, and it's not a new place for Dr. Darity. He's been here several times to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and he wanted to go to a Lobo game because we're doing better than the teams at this point.
It's true.
Alas, there's no Lobo game for last night. He loses out on that score, but we're very delighted to have him here. Let me tell you a little bit about Professor. He teaches where he is a professor of public policy, African and African American studies, and PhD, and has been publishing prolifically for more than 3 decades. That's always one of those hit or miss. I say more than 3 decades, but it does.
That's true.
Too many publications for me to even mention, but I thought that it was amazing the variety of journals that he's published in, and the interdisciplinarity of those journals really are an ideal candidate for this series. And so I wanted to mention his publications include articles in the following journals: Social Science Quarterly, Ethnic and Racial Studies, American Journal of Economics and Sociology, Journal of Socioeconomics, Social Forces, American Economic Review, Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, Transforming Anthropology, American Sociological Review, Journal of Economics and Finance, Journal of Political Economy, Journal of Economic Psychology, American Journal of Public Health, and Review of Black Political Economy. And those aren't all of them, but those are some of them that give you a sense of the range of his work and his interest. And please join me in welcoming William Darity today.
Thank you very much. I hope y'all can hear me, and please bear with me. I'm fighting a bit of a cold, so I may start coughing at some stage, so please hang in there with me. At the moment, I'm teaching a class that's called Social Theory, Economic Policy, and African American Literature. It's a class that, as I say, gives an economist an excuse to spend time examining fiction. And now there are fictions in economics, but so I want to open this conversation today with a discussion of some works in African American fiction that focus on the phenomenon of colorism. And by colorism, I mean a form of racism that establishes a preference for physical attributes that are associated with particular skin shades, typically whiteness. Colorism is not merely the recognition or awareness of variations in appearance among a group, but a systematic privileging or rewarding of some particular attributes over others. And in the case of colorism, the attribute that is rewarded or privileged is generally possessing lighter skin. Okay. And so I'd like to turn first to Zora Neale Hurston's fictionalized autobiography, Dust Tracks on the Road. In chapter 2, which is entitled My Folks, she talks about how her parents first met. And the discussion that she pursues is rife with attention to their physical appearance. Okay. So Hurston says, when she's first describing her father's arrival in the small town of Eatonville, Florida, from notice she says, into this burly, boiling, hard-hitting, rugged, individualistic setting walked one day a tall, heavy-muscled mulatto who resolved to put down roots. Now this tall, heavy-muscled mulatto was John Hurston, who, she says, learned to read and write somehow between cotton choppings and cotton picking, and it might have satisfied him in a way. She goes on to observe, but somehow he took to going to Macedonia Baptist Church on the right side of the creek. So John Hurston, although he was a mulatto, and in the context of the tale she tells, his father was a white man, was on the wrong side of the creek. But he took to going to the church that was on the right side of the creek. He went one time and met up with dark brown Lucy Ann Potts of the land-owning Richard Potts, which might have given him the going habit. He was nearly 20 years old then, and she was 14. My mother used to claim with a smile that she saw him looking at her up there in the choir and wondered what he was looking at her for. She wasn't studying about him. However, when the service was over and he kept standing around never far from her, she asked somebody, "Who is that bee-stung nigger?" Mama couldn't help noticing that his gray-green eyes and light skin stood out sharply from the black-skinned, black-eyed crowd he was in. So from the very outset of her description and discussion of her parents, what's central to it is their physical characteristics, a very relatively light-skinned father, relatively dark-skinned mother. Now, elsewhere, Hurston developed a glossary of Harlem slang. And I want to give you a word of warning. Do not use the internet version of Hurston's Glossary of Harlem Slang. It has been expurgated and edited so that some of the more interesting dimensions of that glossary are not present at all. And I'm going to tell you specifically what's missing in a moment. But much of this glossary focuses on terminology that was used in the black community to describe people based upon how light or how dark they were. Okay? We typically say that in the Latin American context, there's this huge glossary of terms to describe people's appearance. Well, there also is in the United States. Okay, so she offers a color scale, and the color scale includes the following criteria: high yaller, high brown, Vaseline brown, seal brown, low brown, and then there's a category that is omitted altogether from the online version. Dark black, a casually black person. Low black, a blacker person. Lamb black, still blacker than the low black person. And damn black, the blackest man of whom it is said, why lightning bugs follow him at 12 o'clock in the day thinking it's midnight. Okay? Then there's an 8 rock, which is a very black person. There's a Piola, a very white Negro girl. And then there's the expression Pinktoes to refer to a so-called yellow girl. In the online version, the term Pinktoes is changed to pitch toes and is not defined correspondingly. And as far as I know, there never was any slang expression pitch toes that was widely used in the black community. She then mobilizes these terms in her glossary in a bittersweet story that variously has been called Jelly's Tale or Now You're Cooking with Gas, and in which she describes a certain zigaboo called Jelly who was sealskin brown and Papa treetop tall. And she examines this exchange, this banter that goes on between Jelly and his Sweetback, both of them claiming that they have the greater access to gorgeous black women. I turn next to Chester Himes's autobiographical novel, The Third Generation, and his depiction of the volatile relationship between two characters who transparently are his parents, his dark-skinned father and his light-skinned mother. And throughout this novel, at the foundation of the hostile exchanges that take place between his parents are insults and assaults that are hurled from one to the other about their respective physical appearances and what it implies about their ancestry. Himes also has a satirical novel called Pinktoes, which provides a comeuppance to Harlem's disproportionately light-skinned black aristocracy. Now, some of you may be familiar with an old film that was issued in two different. Well, it was remade. So the initial version, I think, was issued in 1934, and then it was remade in the late 1950s, and it was called Imitation of Life. Okay, yeah. All right. And Imitation of Life is essentially the story of a young woman whose mother is black and works as a domestic, and her father is a white man who is never fully specified in the story, and she rejects her mother or distances herself from her mother so she can live the life of a white woman. And her name in the 1934 version of the film is what? Does anyone know?
Was it Pinky?
No, Pinky's another one of those tragic mulatto stories. Yeah, okay. Piola, okay, which is the term that was used for a very light-skinned black woman. Her name is Piola. Now, in Toni Morrison's novel, which I think is the definitive exploration of the phenomenon of colorism, The Bluest Eye, the young woman who is obsessed with obtaining blue eyes is named what? Piccola. And there's a long exegesis in that novel where another young woman, about 12 years of age, is talking about how she and her mother have seen Imitation of Life 7 or 8 times, and makes the point that Piccola's name is very similar to Piola's name. However, and here's the twist and the irony, Piccola is quite dark. And she views herself as being very ugly. In fact, Morrison has her narrator Claudia say, Piccola was ugly because she thought she was ugly. Okay, very, very interesting kind of construction. So the narrator, Claudia, of course, does not want blue eyes, and in contrast, she destroys white dolls in reaction to this phenomenon of the beauty standards that have compelled Piola to think that she is an ugly person. Morrison suggests that both obsessions, Piola's with blue eyes, Claudia's with the destruction of dolls, are unhealthy, but it emerges out of a context in which the greater society has established some beauty norms which constitute an oppressive set of norms for these very young black women in northern Ohio. Now, the final example I would like to share with you is from Stephen Carter's New England White, which was preceded by his superior door jam novel, Emperor of Ocean Park. And in New England White, Carter focuses on the characters of Julia and LeMaster Carlisle. LeMaster Carlisle is the black president of a university that looks remarkably like Yale. And the story revolves around the murder of a black economist, in fact. Yeah. Okay, well, anyway. So there are two black social organizations that are central to this story. One is called the Imperials, which is some sort of approximation of what we know as the Boulets, and the other is called the Ladybugs, which is an approximation of the Lynx. And at one stage in the novel, Julia is reflecting on her relationship with her husband LeMaster and how this has played out in the context of the social circles that she grew up in. And she says the following. Stephen Carter says the following about what she's thinking. He says, and she loved the way that their engagement rocked the clan, because LeMaster Carlisle, whatever his virtues, was not one of us, dear. And then he turned out to be an Imperial. An Imperial? Weren't they all dead or dying? Weren't they practically bankrupt? How could Julia, whose grandmother had founded Ladybugs, marry a mere Imperial? And of course, he was a West Indian and dark-skinned, for the hardy prejudices from the Harlem days still lurked around certain unmentioned corners. Now, I want to propose that in the context of this literature, colorism functions as an atavistic psychosis or neurosis of some type. It is a mental health problem. Okay? It's a mental health problem for the individuals who exercise the dictates of colorism, and it creates a mental health problem for those who are subjected to it. And it appears to be a set of attitudes that are transmitted across generations, a combination of extreme phenotype consciousness coupled with stigmatization of darker skin shades or darker skin shaded individuals. I would add that you then could think about this as a problem that could be resolved with appropriate therapy. Maybe it would fit into this the emphasis that some social workers have given to the notion that the black community is beset by some sort of post-traumatic slavery syndrome or slavery disorder, and so collectively or individually we would benefit from some sort of mental health treatment that would permit us to overcome colorism. I want to propose that actually the phenomenon of colorism is not something that can be understood satisfactorily in the context of individual psychosis. That actually colorism operates as a component or a type of racism in such a way that it is reinforcing certain privileges or proprietary claims that are associated with the groups that do not have the stigmatized characteristics. So that there is, in a sense, a material foundation for colorism. And so I'm going to pursue that in a bit of detail in a moment. But in the meantime, I also want to emphasize that this phenomenon is not uniquely specific to the black American community, nor is it specific to the United States. Okay? So some non-United States examples that are of note involve the widespread use of skin lightening creams in Jamaica, in India, in significant parts of West Africa. Some of you may be familiar with the phenomenon of young women who are described as having a Mirinda face and Coca-Cola legs. Does anybody know what Mirinda is? Mirinda is orange-looking drink, soda. And of course, Coca-Cola is dark brown, right? And so these are young women who have used skin lightening creams, but they couldn't afford a sufficient amount of it to spread it across their entire bodies, and so they only apply it to their faces, and so their faces change color. And this is disturbing. I mean, if you think of somebody whose skin is relatively dark, shifting towards a lighter skin tone that looks almost orange, you might think that there's a health problem that might be associated with that process. I mean, Sammy Sosa did that fairly recently, and so there is a widespread public health problem that's associated with the application and usage and sale of skin lightening creams in a number of places in the world. One of my students, let's see if I can find this. This is really pretty interesting. One of my students, Priyanka Shareja, so she's a Duke student, a senior now, is a regular contributor to an online journal called India Currents. And I want to share what she wrote in one of her columns with you that's pertinent to this discussion. Okay, so Priyanka says, "My best friend from high school and I reeked. We had been backpacking through South India for 3 weeks for our graduation trip, and we had run out of soap. We needed to wash away the stink of sweat and semi-poisonous mosquito repellent. Occasionally dousing ourselves with our bottled Bisleri water, we panted our way to the nearest market. We stopped at a small beauty shop to pick up toiletries. I asked the girl behind the counter to show me some soap. What kind? What do you mean, what kind? I asked. Well, we have soap for the body and soap for the face. In soap for the face, we have soap for oily skin or dry skin or pimply skin, or actually, this one will be good for you, fairness soap. I politely listened to her spiel about how ground pearls and jasmine flowers somehow combine to form this magic cream that naturally makes even the darkest South Indian fair as someone from America. It's called Fair and Lovely. I hear that now they've come out with a Fair and Handsome for men who apparently equally suffer from the burden of being dark. I had to interrupt. I'm sorry, I don't need fairness cream, just soap please. Yet they pushed on. She quickly recruited 2 other shopkeepers, one of them male, and all 3 very kindly assured me that I really did need fairness cream. They said, skin will be so white. Okay. So why do I want to make the claim that this is more than some sort of internal psychological problem that's best dealt with therapeutically? I want to make the claim that colorism has associated with it some very concrete and significant monetary penalties for some. Okay? So in work that I did with Derek Hamilton and Art Goldsmith, we made use of the multi-city study of urban inequality. The multi-city study of urban inequality is a 4-city study that includes, among other kinds of demographic information about individuals, an interviewer rating of the person's skin shade on a scale from 1 to 5, where 1 is the lightest category and 5 is the darkest category. Okay. We proceeded to try to examine whether or not there were variations in the degree of discrimination that we could estimate that were associated with the skin shade variable. And we did this in the context of, to be frank, of what we might call a kitchen sink regression. So let me tell you some of the things that we included as controls in this regression in addition to skin shade variables. So we had controls for an individual's human capital attributes, their level of schooling completed, their retrospective high school performance level. So people were asked, what was your average grade level in A, was your average grade level of B, and so forth. Okay. Their labor market experience, their health status and self-esteem. We also included their demographic characteristics like their age, their marital status, their number of dependents, and whether or not they were a foreign resident at age 16. We had workplace features that we could control for, union status, full-time work status, firm size, whether or not the individual had a supervisory role, and the degree of contact with customers. We also had family and neighborhood characteristics for the individual at age 16, okay? Including mother's education level, father's education level, whether they were raised by both parents, if the family was on welfare, if the family lived in public housing, if the family attended religious services regularly, and if the respondent was ever incarcerated as a youth. And we also had neighborhood features at the time of the interview, perceptions of local school quality, perception of police services, and the perceived level of crime in the neighborhood, okay? All that said, what do we find? We find that darker-skinned and medium-skinned black men suffer a 12 to 15% penalty in wages relative to lighter-skinned black men. And more provocatively, lighter-skinned black men do face of it to suffer a penalty relative to white men, but in sort of the jargon of how we do these things, it's not a statistically significant difference. And so as a consequence, one could argue that the lighter skinned black men really don't face labor market conditions that are significantly different from white men in the United States. So it's the darker skinned and the medium skinned black men who comparably are suffering with this penalty, and it's a substantial penalty. It's a 12 to 15% penalty with respect to wages that's associated purely with the way in which they look. Okay, so that's the first piece of evidence. Second piece of evidence that I want to turn to concerns research that's been done primarily by Jennifer Eberhard at Stanford, who is a social psychologist, where Eberhard has demonstrated that there is a shall we call it a death worthiness penalty that's associated with being darker skinned? So Eberhard had a group of students assess the photographs of individuals who had been convicted of murder, of black men who had been convicted of murder of somebody white in Pennsylvania. And so her students had to grade how black these individuals looked. Okay. Now they did not know that that the individuals who they were looking at were persons who had been convicted of any crime. They just had to grade their appearance. And the outcome of this study was to demonstrate that the blacker looking individuals, particularly individuals who were darker skinned, were much more likely to receive the death penalty than the others for comparable crime. Okay? So there's a criminal justice system related penalty that's very high because it can cost you your life. Okay? And then third, when we started to examine marriage markets, we came up with some interesting insights about whether or not there were benefits for lighter-skinned black women associated with their options that they face in terms of partnering for marriage. And our answers appear to be yes. In a paper that we published in the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, which we tried to be cute, we called it Shedding Light on Marriage. Okay, yeah. We find a couple of things. The first is that lighter-skinned black women are A, at any given age, more likely to be married, okay? B, they are more likely to marry at an earlier age than other black women. And C, they are more likely to remarry if they become unmarried, okay? And moreover, we also found evidence that lighter-skinned black women were much more likely to have spouses who had higher status jobs or better paid jobs, and also close to 50% of the women who self-identified themselves as being biracial, black and white, had white husbands. Okay, so the marriage market is very, very different depending upon the appearance of the woman. If we then think about the implications of this, it gets fairly complicated. Okay. The first thing it tells us is that discrimination doesn't operate in a uniform way across all individuals who might otherwise be classified as black. Okay. But we've known this for a long time. There's a long history of a hierarchical structure within communities that have been formed out of the history of enslavement, not just in the United States, but throughout the Americas, of what we might actually call a pigmentocracy of some sort. Okay? So that has a long history. But the features of much of the African American fictional literature that addresses this phenomenon is a tendency, and I will say the bluest eye actually tells us both stories, but there is a tendency to treat it as a problem that is internal to the black community. But I want to argue that color-based prejudice and its effects are also present outside of the black community, particularly in the context of the employment or labor market, where we find the evidence of these huge penalties associated with being darker skinned. Those huge penalties are the consequences of decisions that are being made overwhelmingly by non-black employers. Okay? In the context of the multi-city study of urban inequality, if you examine the employer file, anywhere from 90 to 95% of the employers are white. Okay, so it's their judgments and their decisions that are having these kinds of an effect. Third thing is that some scholars, like Aaron Gullickson in particular, have argued that the phenomenon of colorism is eroding, that it's not really of significant importance anymore. Sometimes people argue that it's a consequence of the psychological transformation that occurred in the black community as a result of the Black Power movement. Black is beautiful, so people begin to think differently about norms of beauty and standards of beauty. But since our evidence suggests that there's actually a monetary cost or a monetary penalty associated with having darker skin, that creates a deeper kind of inflexibility in terms of trying to address this issue. And so I think we have to look very carefully at these monetary costs and how we might alter that to begin to dislodge the phenomenon of colorism. And then I think the last thing I want to mention today at this point is that Toni Morrison's novel has a valuable, nuanced kind of treatment of this phenomenon, where we can see it internally to the black community and how it's operating and how it's damaging a young woman like Piola. But we're also given significant messages from Morrison about how these norms or beauty standards that are so destructive actually have their origin outside of the black community in terms of which movie stars are the ones who are venerated, whose attractiveness and whose beauty is valued in the society. I mean, if you think about it, one of the characters who Piola is really enthusiastic about and attracted to is Shirley Temple. Okay. Now, Shirley Temple made a number of movies that I think are quite disturbing. And perhaps the most disturbing was a movie called The Littlest Colonel. Okay, so there's a sequence in that movie that okay. The Shirley Temple character's about to have a birthday party, right? And she has always played with the little girls who are enslaved on her family's plantation. Okay. And so she's about to have this birthday party, and so one of the little girls who she normally plays with says, well, am I going to be able to come? And she says, well, I know you can't come, not to this party, but I might save you some crumbs from the cake. And so Shirley Temple is the iconic character for Piola. So sort of the depth of the damage is really quite profound. But I think we have to be aware that the depth of the damage is not solely psychological, that the depth of the damage has repercussions in terms of people's workplace opportunities, who they can partner with as life partners, their chances of getting a relatively more lenient penalty when they are subjected to the whims of the criminal justice system, that there are other kinds of costs that are quite concrete and devastating that are associated with the phenomenon of colorism. And I'll stop there, and we can have a conversation.
Okay, so we are going to thank you, Professor Darity.
Okay.
So we're going to start with a couple of opening questions from Professor Santos and then from Veronica Santos.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Darity, for being here today and sharing your thoughts.
Muy formal.
Yeah.
We've known each other for centuries.
I'll stop there. But as I look at it, some of the work that was done on phenotype, which was originally some of the work that I saw, particularly, Morgia and
Yeah.
it was the National Chicano studies where they're looking at phenotype, and
Right.
anthropologists had long been in there, but when I saw socioeconomics looking at this penalty coming in, there has been work done, and then Patrick Macy and others have followed these phenotype studies. One of the questions that I'll be is from whose perspective is the skin color? You mentioned that in your study that you were looking at, it was the interviewer. So either the interviewer is instructed, and this is more of a technical methodological question that we've been looking at, is who does the rating? Does it make a difference? So that if you were doing the rating, or if I was doing the rating, we may have a different scoring system come in. And so has that affected in terms of when you look at this, is who's doing the looking in there? And you can actually look at it within communities methodologically, so that if you ask, say, among Mexican American groups, there's some groups you say that, gee, you don't look Mexican enough within that group. And so you may want to have some kind of a look in there that might be darker coming in. So as you measure this penalty, is it affected by who's doing the scores in terms? And I guess, like I said, anthropologists have used some kind of, sometimes they talk about using shades that you can actually, like you go to the paint store and you got different shades. Right. But then, is this person dark or is he light skinned? And that to me is an empirical question, is how objective can you get that to really measure that impact?
Okay, so the old National Chicano study looks at two dimensions. Not just skin shade, but as you know, also facial features. So the interviewer was supposed to code whether or not the individual was indigenous looking or not. Okay, not negro looking or not, but indigenous looking or not. Okay, so but that was the interviewer's discretion. Now, in some of these studies where the interviewer ratings are the basis for the criteria. For judgment. They have the interviewers look at photographs before they go in the field and have them do a rating on photographs so that they can be sure that there's a significant degree of consistency in their ratings. In other studies, like the new Immigrant Survey, they actually gave folks a card. I mean, you can go online and look at this. The new Immigrant Survey, they gave folks a card where they have 10 images of hands. And so the interviewer's instructions were to compare the skin shade of the individual's hand against the skin shades that are on the chart and then sign the scores accordingly. And when you have a 10-point scale rather than a 5-point scale, even if there's some fuzziness across interviewers, you find that there really are some important cutoffs that are fairly consistent across all the interviewers. I think the key question is, you probably shouldn't ask individuals themselves to tell us what their skin shade is, because because with the interviewer, we can make a distinction between self-reports and social reports, and we come closer to getting to the social sense of how the individual is perceived from the interviewer's coding. But yeah, it is a problem. The interviewers could be inconsistent, but well-done studies usually try to make sure that they're not.
Well, and actually, that would be a good study, I think, to ask, because we're asking the individual on a telephone survey, all right? But it would be good, I think, to do both, because then you would capture, is there the self-perception versus the outside?
Well, if you could do both, yeah.
That would be a really nice.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
This relates to your point about, is one a victim, I'm really ugly, like you were saying,
Yeah.
the character.
Yeah.
Whether they see themselves, or maybe they see themselves, the more professional, you become more light-skinned, or so you think.
Right.
So
right.
that would be an interesting
Yeah.
study. So that,
Yeah.
that kind
Well, and as the old National Chicano study showed, that if you were darker skinned and more indigenous looking, there was a significant penalty that was associated with that. And I've done, I guess, has Marie Mora already come, or?
Coming, yeah.
She's coming. Okay, so Marie has led a group of us on a project where we actually re-examine immigrants' outcomes using the new Immigrant Survey, and she's got some new findings on the relationship between skin shade and outcomes for Latinos. So yeah. So she may talk about that when she's here. Yeah, Veronica.
Do you expect that these skin coloring would influence educational outcomes, for instance?
Well,
Can you just repeat the
yeah, so the question was, do I expect that skin color,
Influence that skin color, the shade of complexion influenced income, for instance, and it influenced women. What about educational?
okay, so the question is about the effect of skin shade on education outcomes. Okay, so in the work that we've done, we're taking the person's profile in terms of educational attainment and other types of attributes that we might think are productivity linked as given. So we're not inquiring about the processes whereby they acquired those conditions. And we're asking, is there differential treatment that appears to be present in the data in the labor market? And our answer is yes. Now, is there, if we looked at the process of, what do we call it in economics? The pre-market factors? If we looked at the process of acquisition of the pre-market characteristics, then we could raise some very interesting questions about whether or not the person's skin shade is affecting how much educational attainment they achieve or the quality of schooling that they receive. We aren't able to do that in the data that we're looking at. But I think it's an interesting and important question, and I think you and a number of people have suggested that in their experience there may be some evidence that kids are treated differentially by teachers or by school systems based on how they look. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask a question, then I'll
Okay.
come to you.
Okay.
So my question is, you said earlier in your comments that you felt that this was applicable in a lot of other settings, and Professor Santos, and I think implicitly that Veronica and her comments are suggesting that there might be some parallels here, and I want to bring it very directly to where we are, and Asian Americans and Hispanics. Mexican Americans here in New Mexico, and I'm reminded of one of the very early travel accounts of a white who had come to New Mexico in the 1850s, W.H.H. Davis, who was the first U.S. attorney here, and his papers, actually, his original draft of his manuscript, which was published, is actually in the Center for Southwest Studies at Zimmerman Library. The original is there, and it was published, it's been published a couple of times since then. But one of the things that so what he did is he was the prosecutor for the federal government. This was a territory at the time, and he would ride circuit, right? So he would have to ride around New Mexico and see what crimes were there to be reported and so forth. And it was pretty rough. It's not like there were any hotels or motels or anything. So he would stay with whoever was the most prosperous person in the village where they were. Wasn't too prosperous according to his report, right? It was very rustic, and the book is looking at it with our eyes today, we say, oh, how racist, how outrageous it is, the things that he says about the Indians here and about the Mexican people here at the time. But it's very interesting as a the elite Hispanics use of lightening creams at the time. And of course, at that time, that would have been used extensively by African American women in other parts of the country. So we know that that was happening here. In the American Indian community, there are very interesting debates about color here. Sometimes they even come around to faculty politics and who gets hired and who doesn't get hired. And so these issues are here. And I know that some of your other research has looked at Latino identity and how we measure identity and maybe what we might describe as the gap between self-reported race and assignment by others or social race. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you think some of this might apply in this context. And I'm also going to throw this out as an invitation to the audience, because I think graduate students here today, there's a lot of research on New Mexico in this area that I think could be done and hasn't been done, and I think it would be a really rich site for research. So maybe you can address that, and then maybe later on with the other people want to come back.
So, yeah. Was there a question? Okay. So, in some of the work that we've done on Latino identity, we found that it's really critical that you have a data set that has not only information about how people self-report their race, but also that you have information about how people might look physically, particularly with respect to something like skin shade. And a very glaring example is some recent work that we've done with the new Immigrant Survey, where we find that if you look at Latino immigrants' responses to the race question, and you use that in an analysis where you're trying to detect the presence of some sort of wage discrimination, you get no effect. So you don't find any evidence of race-based wage discrimination against Latinos. Okay. On the other hand, if you use the color schema, which is assigned by the interviewer, you do find significant penalties for being darker skinned if you are a Latino. So then I was somewhat curious as to what might be going on here. And so what we found was, in the new Immigrant Survey, they essentially give people the census tableau of race categories to respond to. So it's not an open-ended question. People are given a checklist. I personally think that in asking the race question, I think we should continue to ask it, but in asking the race question, I think the race question ought to be open-ended. I think that you should not give people little boxes to fill out. Just let them say whatever they want to say. Okay, that's my personal preference. But I also think you need phenotype information, and here's why. We discovered, in looking back at the responses to the race question in the new Immigrant Survey, close to 70% of the Latino respondents said their race was what? White, right? And so if you're getting variation in treatment that's associated with the way in which the individual looks, you're not going to capture that because it's getting wiped out by all these individuals saying they're white. Okay, and so that made it particularly salient for us to say that it's important to know how people are perceived, not simply how they self-report their race, because the way in which they're perceived is govern how they're going to be, is going to govern to a large degree how they're treated in day-to-day life. So I don't know if that answers what you're asking. Yeah.
This is a question about the data set you used on your regional study.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you controlled for juvenile incarceration.
For the person's response as to whether or not they had ever been incarcerated.
Did the data set omit individuals who may have had an adult conviction or incarceration?
No, it didn't omit them, it just didn't ask.
They didn't ask?
Yeah, they didn't ask, yeah, they had an adult conviction. But there's a separate study that Diva Pager did. I think it's a New York City-based study, where she finds, and now this is not a color-based study, but she finds that white males with a history of having been incarcerated have greater odds of job callbacks than black males with no history of being incarcerated at similar ages and educational levels. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I was thinking about Dr. Stanton's discussion of studies that I read in Brazil, where the interviewer's evaluation of the subject's status, whether they were the way that they talk, and any initial cues that they give about the person's general status,
Yeah.
actually affect how they rate them. So that I was wondering about people reaction time, so that I read a particular one that Ford Foundation study in Brazil that said that women who were really high status and some sort of objective measure of color would have been classified as really dark, but because they were considered really high status, the interviewer.
Well, I would have thought that was a null set. You didn't get it. No, I mean, the high status, dark skinned women in Brazil, who are they? No, I'm serious, you know, yeah.
But I was wondering in your study whether
No, you're raising an interesting question, which is what is the interviewer using as their information for coding? And if they're faithfully following the hand chart, that's one thing. If they're not, then we're in dicier territory. But I do know this, in Edward Tellez's work, in Tellez's work, you do find that that marginally the interviewers tend to code people in darker skin shade categories than the individual tends to report themselves. But that still doesn't mitigate the effect that you're describing. It could be there, yeah.
I think the last question might have been referring to the idea that money makes the skin grow white.
Yeah.
That notion. I'm not sure.
So we did a study that doesn't get at it quite sufficiently, okay? Yeah. Well, no, I was going to tell you about this. So there's a study that I did with Tanya Boza-Golash where we treat people's self-reported race as the dependent variable. And one of the things that we control for is their income and earnings, okay? And we don't find that their inclination to self-report their race is affected by their own income and earnings. But that is very different. That's a bit different from whether or not other people will look at their income and earnings and interpret their behavior differently. I think that there's a bit of mysticism about this. I think that Pele could say he's white, but I don't think other Brazilians see him as white, okay? So no matter how rich and high status he is. Yeah. Okay. So the closest we can get to examining that and trying to control for these other kinds of physical characteristics is probably in the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health. Because AdHealth has information about, let me get this right, hair color, eye color, skin shade, whether or not the interviewer perceives the person to be overweight, normal weight, or underweight. And one more thing, which is kind of interesting. The interviewer indicates whether or not they perceive the person to be attractive looking. No, it doesn't. I said this is the closest we can get.
My hunch is that you could figure out how to rationalize this thing.
Yeah.
That people who had more quote-unquote neat very big features
Well, certainly.
would be seen as blacker than people without them.
Certainly. In Jennifer Eberhardt's study, that's precisely what occurs. Where the rating is not just on what your skin shade is, but whether you look blacker or not.
And other sorts of things, like the
Yeah, yeah,
shape of one's buttocks, all these things that people associate stereotypically.
yeah.
And not just with blacks, but with Native Americans. I think
Yeah.
people across the board, that if people had those physiological traits that people stereotypically associate with social constructed race, then they would probably see those people as darker as a result.
If they saw other features, yeah.
Yeah, and then those two things would interact with each other. So the darkest people would have the most, people seen as darkest would have
Yeah.
the most.
Yeah, I can't answer that. That would be interesting to.
Isn't that a methodological problem though?
Yeah.
When you do quantitative analysis, isn't that culinarity or something? I don't know if there's.
Well, no, it gets at the question. It gets at the question as to what signals the interviewer is using to gauge the person's skin shade.
Also could get, if you're putting them in the same regression.
Yeah. Okay. Starting with you.
I'm really excited to putting together details in a process that doesn't much work out like. For all the fundamentals that we wait so that part I think is pretty exciting. Now we can account and we can accrue the knowledge that we do apply what we have been experiencing. And that's wonderful. The question I have, and maybe an unfair question is, okay, so now we have documented all of this. What is this?
Yeah.
What does it go in terms of policies? How do you change the structures of places like all programs here at the university? If we had at the university, what does it begin to switch? It's a very harmful thing that we call racism.
Yeah. Well, so the question is, what do we do now that we have this information about how certain mechanisms of racism operate? What policies do we adopt? So, well, if you look at my personal history of policy advocacy, you'll find that I'm an advocate of reparations. Okay. But when we start talking about colorism, it would suggest that, something that I would not necessarily propose, that there might have to be some differentiation in the magnitude of reparations that are given to people based on their appearance. But I'm not an advocate of that. I want to go a step further on that issue because at this political moment, it's virtually impossible to promote any program that is targeted for African Americans, never mind darker skinned African Americans versus lighter skinned African Americans. So when you start to ask me about policy considerations, I keep trying to come up with an array of programs that would be universally applicable, but might have a disproportionately beneficial effect on segments of the population that are disproportionately suffering. So I've been advocating this baby bonds proposal, which is a proposal to provide any child who is born into a family whose wealth level falls below a certain level, a federal trust fund that they could access at age 18. And for the kids who are born into families at the lowest level of the wealth distribution, that trust fund could be anywhere from $50,000 to $60,000. I'm also an advocate of a universal federal job guarantee. The federal government should guarantee every American citizen the opportunity to work in a well-developed federal program for the provision of infrastructure and the like. So when you ask me about policy, I really don't hone in on policies that are supposed to be specifically directed at the group that is most disadvantaged by processes of colorism. I try to come up with policies that actually could be applied universally, but might actually benefit those individuals in a significant way. I don't know if that... Well, there are court cases that have been brought not around racism that's directed at individuals because they are black, but because of their physical appearance or skin shade. So you could go the route of litigation around this, which some people have attempted to do. But I'm never convinced that litigation eliminates the phenomenon, right? I mean, it's potentially a corrective, it's potentially, people may get some sort of reparative or retributive justice out of the process, but it doesn't stop it from continuing to happen. And so I guess I'm thinking more about, if it continues to happen, what kind of structure can we put in place that will make it possible for people not to suffer as much from it? Yeah, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Dark African American men have taken in the labor force. What about women?
Yeah. So.
And then also with the marriage market, you gave the example of women. What about men?
So in the U.S., there's an asymmetry. So the labor market penalties are far more dramatic for men, and the marriage market penalties are far more dramatic for women.
But do you still find them?
They're much milder for the other gender group in each setting. Yeah. And I you know, in the Indian context, the bridal advertisement will frequently indicate that the bride that is preferred is Swedish or fair-skinned. Okay, Swedish, like wheat-colored, yeah, not Swedish. That's Tiger Woods. That's a different thing. Yeah. Right. yeah. But you don't see the same kind of pattern of itemization of requests for that for the male. You know, so there's, you know, I think that there's more of a burden in the marriage market for women, and there's more of a burden in the labor market for men. I do think, yeah.
I really like your research and the idea of trying to research colorism. I wonder sometimes as a researcher, if you're collecting your own data and you're trying to use this color as a way to collect some data on race, what are the possible ethical or kind of negative implications in kind of perpetuating the idea of race as biological or some kind of natural difference, instead of emphasizing that outsider perceptions and this hierarchy? And so I wonder, as a researcher, if there are ethical issues of trying to use this kind of color shading in your data collection. And I know most of the data that you're using is kind of secondary data that you may not have collected, so you may not have had to go through IRB or things like that. But what are the issues of trying to do this?
Well, so I don't have any inclination to think that skin shade in and of itself is telling us anything very particular about race as a binary category. So I you know, hadn't really thought about that.
Well, I just wonder how we make sure that we're not claiming, this is not what we're claiming. We're claiming something different. But how do we be clear in the presentation of our research so that it doesn't get transmitted in that way?
Well, you know, I don't know. You know, how do you prevent people from who are inclined to think that way from doing so? I do know that if you know, that there's actually a relatively weak relationship between skin shade and attempts to identify DNA markers for African ancestry. So I think people automatically assume frequently that the darker an individual is, the more African they are. This is not true. But I mean, maybe we just need to keep saying that in the context of doing these kinds of studies. Yeah, there are some people who reacted to this study saying that the skin shade effect is capturing some sort of biological deficiency on the part of the darker skinned individuals. But it's never something that I thought, and nor would I ever be inclined to say. So I guess it's just a question of, you know, being vigilant and responding to people who have asked that kind of interpretation. Yeah. Okay, I'll get you. So sorry.
Go ahead. You made a great point on all your studies on disparate impact in the United States. And I was just going I've read just a tiny little bit about this. I just want to know your take on it. So psychologists, especially Anthony Greenwald at the University of Washington, they do experiments basically in some way, shape, or form saying good or bad. And they've got people who are black. So people will code themselves not to seem racially biased. If they give enough time, they make them go fast. Now,
The self-censorship issue.
right, and I don't have any agenda, but I'm just curious what you think. They did an experiment where they did that test and they found with the control group elements of racial bias and how people responded under time sensitivity. But then they had another group in which they showed black role models. So for instance, I go before this whole, Michael Jordan or, other prominent.
Another great Great basketball player.
Barack Obama. I'm trying to come up this was before. Anyways, and then it seemed people were much less likely to have the. So is that? Could you just talk about whether there's any opportunities in that type, promote more black leadership and make that?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I was talking earlier today about with the group of RWJ fellows about Claude Steele's stereotype credit hypothesis. I was wondering aloud about factors that could insulate individuals from the effects of stereotype credit. And so I think in a way you're sort of asking something that's related to that. What's protective in some way?
Well, you have. I find it difficult to talk about race and all. Well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but we base our opinions in society based on people. Right? So the more you see in the public eye.
Yeah.
So if there are negative or positive people with whatever attributes you're looking at,
Yeah.
then you may form opinions based on it, for good or for bad.
So here's the connection to stereotype credit. There are people who argue that prior to having a young black person perform a task that is a task that's freighted with general societal expectations that their kind of folk don't do that task well, that you give them images of positive role models and that might deflect or diffuse the stereotype threat effect. And I don't know the answer. I don't know how effective that is. That's what Claude Steele's sometime collaborator Joshua Aronson has been focused on, is strategies for insulating youth from stereotype effects. And it's included examining the particular kind of strategy you're talking about. But I think the jury's still out on how effective that is. I just don't know yet. Yeah. But it's a good question. Yeah. Oh, way in the back. You've been patient.
I was just thinking of the lady who was talking about, I presume, the triggers of pigeonholing.
Yeah.
She probably attempted to say that depending on the experiences and philosophical supposition, what we have been taught and learned, that's what makes us to pigeonhole in the first place.
Right.
Unless she was trying to articulate that, which is probably true. Depends on what we have learned. We'll apply the same knowledge, when we do our schooling, that's the kind of infrastructure we use to teach others. But as far as the isms, just thinking colorism, racism, and fascism and all that, I think they're all related. They're part and parcel. I'm just asking, I'm presuming that, do you think they are related, part of the same major topic, then subtopics come out of that? And they're all based on the early learning and essentially brainwashing of individuals before they're able to make decisions for themselves. And to do the opposite, we have to reverse the process. Just a proposal.
Yes, and I don't disagree with that, but I don't think that's sufficient because, I'm emphatic about the view that I think that there are material benefits for some that are associated with the engaging in these types of practices. That the people just don't do this exclusively because, you know, they're nasty people. I think they do this because there are some concrete benefits that they feel will devolve to them and will devolve to their children and their children's children as a consequence of preserving these kinds of racialized or colorized hierarchies. So unless we address that structure of benefit and disadvantage in some way, I don't think we'll, you know, I don't think this early learning will ever be sufficient to overcome the problem.
Professor Darity, I know that Nancy has been trying to get in for a while.
And there's actually one person who's had her hand, I think, from the very beginning, so I don't know if you want to jump in before I ask
Okay,
my
well,
question.
just real quick, because and it hadn't been thought and question, but I just need to talk about for quickly. So, bravo, because it's been maybe only 15 years since racism has been really looked at as a mental health issue. So bravo to you for that. And it's very paramount that we continue to do that as minorities. So wherever that may lie, whatever group you may be in, it's important that you do investigate your own group and white groups and use these terms. It's important that we look within the African American community at the various shades. So even if it's 1 through 5, you know, you're looking at maybe a quadroon to a biracial to someone who is born of parents of full African descent, which I
There's very few.
But just now jumps to my original thought process, and that was when you were looking at the marital marking and the African American of lighter expression, you indicated that their chances of remarrying were quite higher than of darker skinned ones.
Yeah.
Did you find that if that lighter skinned woman was educated, coming also from a higher SES, and was more militant and had not the stereotypical Anglo, quote unquote, definition of beauty? I wonder what those numbers are.
I don't know. Don't know the answer. The data about husband characteristics is actually drawn from the American Community Survey, and there's no direct phenotype information in the American Community Survey. What you have is people self-reporting their race. So we looked at and compared the women who said that they were biracial, black and white, against the women who said they were black. And so that's where we discovered that there was a high proportion of these so-called biracial women who had white husbands and also whose husbands tended to have higher status and higher income. But I can't answer the question about the ideological orientation of any of these persons. It's interesting you ask that because there's a project that we want to pursue where we're trying to examine whether or not your racial ideological identification either insulates you from or causes stereotype threat effects to be more dramatic.
Well, that's exactly why I brought that up, because growing up, I self-identified as quadroon, so an Afro-Cuban Irish, right? So, and I actually married a European, and had more, during that phase of my life, looked more Anglo, and just may have repressed my private school upbringing and so forth and so on, from the standpoint of who my ancestry was. Then post my divorce, this is who I am. And I'm more in tune with my African-Cuban side and investigating that. And I have personally experienced more institutional racism, but I would have to say, bravo to the University of New Mexico, I was hired sight unseen. And so my CV preceded me. My surname happens to be European, so that could have been it also. But if they had
Well, sense of that they can change. We find in longitudinal studies that the same individual may report a different race in different years. And so again, I think that reinforces my belief that it's really important to know something about how the person is perceived by others. That's really
And that was a great segue to the question that I wanted to pose, and I appreciate your comments about the limitations of census data because it's self-reported, but I know that you've probably seen John Logan's work that uses that data to show that for Latinos, even with the self-reported and all the limitations, you find differences not only in housing and wealth and education and so on. And most recently, there's a paper that addresses your specific question, which is about political orientation, that self-reported Latinos who identify as white tend to have a more conservative profile. So I was curious to see if you had any data set, access to data set that asks that very question about political orientation.
with skin shade.
With skin shade.
Besides the Latino National Political Survey, which is almost 30 years old now, right? It is 30. Maybe the new version of the National Survey of Black America, which is called it's something like American Survey of Communities as Life or something like that. It's the newer survey, and I believe it has skin shade information and some information about political ethics. Way in the back.
Yes, so I'm interested in how this project has implications for your reparations work.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm wondering if differences in how people perceive their own color have implications for whether or not they think that African Americans deserve reparations. And it's beyond the scope of this project. Right?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer.
It's a similar question about ideology, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Just tie in a little bit.
See, I don't really have a prior that people's skin shade and their ideology go hand in hand necessarily. But I don't know. I mean, we haven't really looked at it.
Yeah, the question actually comes from Nepal, where you have upper caste individuals who see it as taboo to get reparations for being displaced, forced expulsion from their homes, because then they would be associated with being an internally displaced person. So they forego reparations opportunities.
Well,
So
if the day ever came where reparations were provided to African Americans, I leave any brothers and sisters free to choose not to take it.
Right.
I'm gonna take it.
But it's really, if I could, a second part is really about the question of you're talking about the criminal justice system and how it affects African Americans, but the perception of whether or not you're a victim and if you can have access to the criminal justice system at all. And does that vary if you think that you understand, you see that you experience either a human rights atrocity or a crime, and whether or not you think that you would be served through the criminal justice system or not, and if that varies based on skin color.
I think it does, but again, people's perceptions and attitudes and political beliefs and the relationship with skin color is relatively inadequately explored in comparison with the relationship to things like labor market outcomes or marriage outcomes.
So one of the things that, if we sort of summarize several of the questions here, and look, there's two strands in a lot of this thinking about race. One that I think a lot of people have been bringing up, but I see you as writing against, and that is the idea of seeing race as a individualized problem of prejudice and a psychological problem and a cognitive problem, and that's perfectly legitimate, right? But that's not the view that you're espousing, which is about structure and material.
It has those dimensions. I don't deny that those dimensions are there, but I don't think you're going to get rid of it.
Well, I wonder if you could just make a stronger argument for your case that we should be seeing race in that structural material dimension rather than at an individual level, or maybe
I don't know if I can make
you're more.
I don't know if I can make a stronger argument. Maybe I can make a slightly different one. I mean, I think it's really the all Ford Bloomer debate. Okay, so yeah, It really is. I mean, that's Gordon Allport's 1954 book, The Nature of Prejudice, essentially argues that prejudice and bias is the equivalent of a psychosis. Okay, and he advocates using structured contact as a way to overcome this psychosis, so that your contact would have to have certain optimal characteristics. The members of the two groups would have to enter into this contact experience as equal status groups. There would have to be sanctions from some respected authority for them to interact. There would need to be some common goal that they were working toward, and they would have to be in competition. Okay, so actually you're creating artificial circumstances, right? So because when they come out of the structured setting, they will be in competition. They won't have equal status. They probably will not have the sanction of all relevant authorities, and they may not be working toward a common goal, right? So Allport's claim was, though, that these structured contacts could have the effect of reducing prejudice. And Herbert Bloomer in 1958, in an article where he says, he doesn't mention Allport at all, but he essentially argues, no, this notion of prejudice as a problem that resides within the individual ignores its foundation in relative group position. And so I'm on the side of the fence that says that the problem is fundamentally associated with the way in which relative group position operates in our society. And so that's why I don't think treating it as an individual psychosis is adequate. I don't object to structured contact. It's wonderful. People feel better after they do it. But I don't think we really get at the heart of matters. Yeah, okay.
I think you're next.
All right, try that religion.
I'm curious. I'm curious, time here, these issues of reparations, given the fact that slavery was a widespread problem that, obviously affected African Americans for centuries.
Well, you've leaped to a big assumption that my case for reparations is based on slavery.
Certainly.
No, my case for reparations is based primarily on Jim Crow. Different issue.
Given the fact that slavery did affect all African Americans, I'm curious, when did we start to see this material component of colorism that you talked about? I mean, was it right after the end of slavery, or was it not until Jim Crow?
No, it was created in slavery. The material component of colorism was created within slavery. The relatively lighter-skinned slaves, for the most part, were in had the softer positions within the plantation setting, or if they were on small farms, they may have been more likely to work indoors than outdoors, etc. So there was a hierarchy that was created that was skin color linked within slavery. And so if you look at who the free slaves were, or the free blacks were during slavery times, they disproportionately fall under the category that the census would have classified as mulattoes. And so, so there was a certain advantage, relative advantage, that was already possessed by lighter-skinned blacks on average, not all, but on average, during slavery. And so that's where it begins. Yeah. Oh yeah, and it's not unique to the U.S. It's an America's phenomenon. Yeah.
Well, in Africa,
well,
genocide's based on things like that.
Yeah, but that's not the same time period. I mean, yeah, I mean, if we start thinking about Rwanda and Burundi, we have to develop this.
So, I apologize, I totally buy your argument. I'm 100% with you on that. My questions have to do with history and time depth of human autocracy and how far we can trace it across populations. So, no, not really. I don't think so.
Okay.
What I think is that race is a concept, so therefore more simple black and white issue.
Okay, so
And
even,
then
yeah, that's a
there-
great question, but
Yeah,
don't
yeah,
forget
no,
what you're gonna ask next.
Cool.
Even in our work, it's not quite a graduation. Okay, so there's dark skin, medium skin black men. Their labor market situations are relatively similar. What is different from this category of men who are in the light skin category. And the men in the light skin category are also numerically the smallest portion of the sample of black men. Okay. So it's actually, it's more dichotomous than graduated. Okay, so I don't know.
That gets to some of it. It does. Another question I have would be, this is also a historical perspective. We go back, say, well, maybe a little more than that. Let's go back to the 19-teens, 1920s. You see a lot of discrimination against people who today would not be considered people of color. And so we're talking again about, I'm talking about Jews, Italians.
Oh, yeah, the people who became white.
That's right. The people who became white. So what I work about is, even today, using these tests today, looking at human targeting within white populations. I'm just wondering if there's like well, you're white enough.
I don't think that if we look at people who are self-reported to be white in most of these studies, we don't really find variations in outcomes when we measure their skin shades.
So that work's been done?
Yeah. You can do it with the multi-city study. We did it. You could be white and tan, right?
Right.
And actually, that's a signal of being relatively privileged, right? Yeah. And there's no penalty for being tan. Okay. So once you're in the white category,
So I wonder.
Skin shade is not as salient as if you're in the black category.
It's interesting, and it brings up more again about the facial feature issue. Then because you have the same. I actually had this happen this the other day in where we have somebody who's half Persian and somebody who's Italian. The Italian person was they compared each other, and she was darker than the half Persian. So I'm really surprised by that. But yeah. But she was surprised.
I mean, which country's closer to Africa?
Yeah. But the same features are white, and she would be considered white, So I'm really interested in further investigation of these, like what goes with skin color, how are those things work.
So you're interested in more of this nexus of physical attributes.
For a lot of reasons, but it's interesting. I'm glad to hear that work's been done.
So we're going to take two more questions, only of people who have not asked a question so far.
Okay, so you haven't asked a question.
Okay, then, I guess I have to say my commentary because it's longer than my question.
You can do both, Jamal.
Oh, thank you.
You can take more than 5 minutes.
That's about as much time as I can do in our forums, isn't it? Anyway, through the transdisciplinary working group of study of race and social justice, we often talk about these questions of race versus racism. And in most studies and things that we've looked at, we've often determined that, as many people probably know already, that race is not a biological concept, but a social political concept. And when you add the economics layer to that, it has a much stronger flavor when we look at the interactions. As a proxy measure, my thing is that, I think we should start looking at race per se, look at racism, phenomenal racism itself, as we deal with structures and organizations and those privileges and issues of power. Because I have lots of questions about methodologies as well as the philosophical issues behind much of the science in many ways. But I think following on to this question, I would say, have you looked at any studies or know of any studies that particularly look at white identity in terms of economic development and power and privilege? Because we're always talking about the other, we're always talking about people of color and pigment documents. Right. Can we document the power and privileges in economic?
You're talking about ideology within whites. I can't instantly think of something. I mean, one would presume there must be something like this. I know that the old work that was anime really was work that was focused on, initially was work that was almost exclusively on whites, particularly white working class individuals, because there was this nervousness that you could replicate what had happened in Germany and the United States. But I'm not sure beyond that. I would think there is, but I just don't know.
Just sort of a question. Have you looked at, I can't remember the author of the study, it was in a
indicators is the work that I've done with Derek Hamilton on so-called occupational crowding.
Yeah.
And relative to educational attainment, where do people